Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast for Age Soul War. Today we are going to California, sunny Southern California again. And instead of lemons and oranges, we're going to talk about wine, which is going to be amazing. Hopefully you have a wine glass to enjoy while you listen to this conversation today. Our guest today is Julia Ornelas Higton. She is an assistant professor of history at CSU Channel Islands. Beautiful campus. You should look it up. She has a PhD from the University of Southern California. And her book that we are going to talk about, which came out in November of 2023 with the University of Nebraska Press, is beautifully entitled The Grapes of Conquest, Race, Labor, and the Industrialization of California Wine, 1769 to 1920. Julia, wonderful to have you on the podcast. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah.
So let me right away start here and ask, how do you write a book about wine?
Oh, that's a great question. And thanks for the invitation and for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
You're welcome.
My book really grew out of a general interest on agriculture in California. I am the granddaughter of braceros, who were Mexican contract workers in the early 20th century. And I thought I was going to write a dissertation about Mexican migrant laborers in California. But as I started to research, I made this realization that Chinese workers were involved in the wine industry, and that just piqued my interest. So I pushed myself further back. And, I'd always had an interest in citrus.
Mm-hmm.
It's hugely important to the state of California, to our history. And I just landed serendipitously on wine, realizing that very little scholarship had been written on the pre-World War II history of the industry. So that is
Mm-hmm.
how I ended up with this book.
Which is phenomenal to think about because it's like you have such a rich history in your book, which is almost all pre First World War. So it's
Mhm.
like, how can you overlook this?
Yeah, it's a
Like,
great question. Yeah, it's a really great question.
it's like you're showing it goes back into colonial times when the first Spanish arrived with the missions. So it's kind of like you have hundreds of years of wine growing. How do you not like? Why has no one ever talked about this? Is it what's your thought about it? Why do you think it is?
I think there's multiple reasons for that. One, the citrus industry lasted so long.
Mm,
Its cultural impact really began in the 1880s in Southern California. And we
yeah.
still have people today
Hmm.
um, who remember working in the packing houses at their height. Of course,
Right.
today those packing houses are now condos and shops. But in my county here in Ventura County, where I am located, citrus is still very important.
Hmm.
So I think the legacy of citrus has perhaps been more omnipresent in in folks' awareness.
Mm,
But I don't think that's not an excuse. I mean, we still drink wine. It's
right.
still very important to the state's economy. I think the other answer I would give is that historians, I would say really, really recently, have started to turn a more critical eye to the missions,
Mm,
and as
mm,
has the public.
yeah.
We no longer accept them as these, neutral spaces,
Mm. Oh.
spaces of public memory. So I think that critical eye is also really important to looking at what really happened in the missions,
Hmm.
um, and the labor there, and what was created, what was grown, etc.
Right. No, yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that California does more with it because the missions are such a very, like, it's still a tourist attraction, but it's such a like multi-layered and difficult and like bad history on so many levels too that you're dealing with there. So the other parts that and I kind of find it fascinating because you have such a beautiful origin story with your personal experience in the book to start of like how you what was it you went to a wine tasting and it struck you that they kind of have this embellished history at that winery you went to. How often is that these wineries just dare I say make things up to create a nice story for their wine?
Yeah. Again, a fantastic question because, as you're pointing out, with my own experience, and that of probably many of your listeners, wine in California is intimately and intricately connected to tourism.
Hmm.
Wine is a food product, right? It's
Yeah.
something restaurants buy, it's something that's marketed around the world. Certainly, California wine, particularly that's coming out of Napa
Mhm.
and Sonoma, has a certain cultural cachet,
Yeah.
right? Yet, when you go to the wineries, the history that I tell in my book, which is not, it's not always a pretty history. It's a
Mhm.
history of colonization and conquest and race
Mhm.
making. That history is strangely absent from the wineries. And I say this pretty confidently. I grew up in the shadow of the Napa and Sonoma Valley.
Mhm.
When you grow up where I grew up, if you have family visiting from out of town, that's where you take
It,
them. So since childhood, I have memories of wandering, bored out of my mind, of course,
yeah.
wandering wineries, exploring the square in Sonoma, and the
Mhm.
story that is told there really glosses over the complex legacy
Yeah.
of that period. And then, most of my book is really centered on Southern California.
Mhm.
The history of wine growing in the Los Angeles region, it's beginning to be explored. There's folks doing amazing work in public history and sort of peeling back the layers of land use in downtown Los
Yeah.
Angeles and in Inglewood. But by and large, because the lines aren't here, it's just not part of the history that's told.
Yeah. No, and I found it so fascinating where you later in the book you have that story about Anaheim, right? And like I talked with Brian Jenkins a few weeks ago about his book about oranges and lemons and citrus growing in California. And we all have that image, right, of Walt Disney buys these lemon and orange groves in Anaheim and turns it into Disneyland. And no one ever talks about like there being wine prior to this to the citrus empire in that region. It's
Mhm.
it's it it almost feels like willful forgetting of like we only remember that big industry because that's sort of the one that we want to remember, I guess.
Yeah. That's such a great point, Niels. And what many people don't know is that Anaheim was founded as a German colony by
Yeah.
a group of Germans
Hmm.
who had immigrated to California in the
Yeah.
1850s. They weren't making it as gold miners, and they created this cooperative joint stock company,
Hmm.
hired someone to scout out land for them, buy it, and plant vineyards for them while they worked up in
Hmm.
San Francisco. And this became a thriving, successful
Yeah.
wine town. Wine town. This is
Yeah.
essentially what it
Yeah.
was.
Crazy.
Uh, and it was really an amazing place. It was this German island surrounded by Mexican, Californio, Spanish-speaking neighbors,
Mhm.
cattle
Yeah.
ranchers, most of them. And they took up viticulture and sold their wine and did quite well for themselves until Anaheim disease struck. We now know it as Pierce's disease,
Yeah.
but that essentially destroyed their entire
Mhm.
millions of vines, and slowly that spread across the Southland, which is why we don't
Oh,
associate wine with Anaheim anymore.
right.
Uh,
Right.
one story that I wasn't able to include in the book, but I'll share with you now, is that if you've ever been to Disneyland and its neighboring park, California
Hmm.
Adventures, they had for many years about 3 or 4 rows of grapevines planted in the park.
Oh.
According to legend, those grapevines would get infected with Pierce's disease, and have to be ripped out and replanted every couple of years. I tried very hard to verify this with the Disney Corporation, but unfortunately, they never returned my emails or calls. Wasn't able to
Oh,
validate this and include it in the book. I wish I had been able to figure out if that was
wow.
actually true. Yeah,
I
his
may have to
Pierce's
tax the
disease.
Disney Corporation now and the when I release the video, kind of be like, give us a
Yeah,
statement.
yeah, but certainly wine is part of that park.
Yeah,
It's part of that park, even though they don't
yeah,
acknowledge that it literally that was a wine
right.
growing region,
Yeah,
you
that's
know,
crazy.
1850s to the 1890s.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
not part of Disney's history.
Yeah, and it's sort of like you can think of like those counterfactuals, right? Of like how would the Southland have been different if it hadn't been for that disease, and wine would have continued, and like the rivalry between the orange growers and the wine growers potentially been much stronger, or
Mhm.
like who knows, like if they had bought each other out or fought each other, or what would have happened?
It's interesting to consider that. And I will say that there was a little bit of a legacy with the wine industry. As you mentioned, I end the book pretty much around World War One and the start of Prohibition. But one legacy of Anaheim, moving into Prohibition, and even before that, in the 19 aughts
Hmm.
and teens, when Prohibition started gaining ground and individual towns and counties started to go dry. Anaheim never went dry. It
Uh,
was a quote unquote wet island surrounded by dry towns in Orange County.
oh
So
my
it was
gosh.
a watering hole for oil workers and citrus
Yeah,
workers all around. So that legacy of culture, that legacy and that culture that celebrated
yeah,
wine and beer consumption carried on until, of course,
right.
Prohibition shut it down.
That is just so fascinating to think of that place where the family park is today, or the family adventure, the kind of family friendly place was the drinking place of the region.
Mhm.
Oh goodness. I want to turns out to the you mentioned that Anaheim being that sort of German island, and you have a lot of like you have Germans, you have Italians, you have some French people in your books that you talk about as sort of individuals that starts these these vineyards, or that are brought in to kind of fix problems with existing ones. And I kind of wondered, are these actual people that have any experience with wine, or are we just turning to them because it's like, oh, they're from Germany, they know how to do wine, or oh, they're from France, they know how to do wine. Is it just kind of like because you're from a country we think you know, or is it that they actually know?
Yeah. Many of these folks didn't have any experience
Yeah.
with wine or even agriculture sometimes. If I go back to the Germans in Anaheim, none of them had experience with agriculture. None of them had any
Yeah.
experience with winemaking. They had one person who had brewed beer in Germany, but that's a very different process.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so they were really self-appointed experts who, you know, educated themselves, figured
yeah,
it out.
yeah.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that many of these immigrants are all newcomers to California in the 1850s, took up wine growing because this is also a period
Mm,
where the state started to organize trade groups and the California
right.
State Agricultural Society. So there was an emphasis on scientific growing, on
Hmm.
getting educated. Of course, the University of California was founded in the late 1860s and it
Yeah.
had a College of Agriculture. So this is a very rich period for agriculture where farmers and growers are looking to the experts.
Mm-hmm.
They're published, and these experts were publishing treatises,
Yeah.
publishing the records of their meetings in the local newspapers.
Hmm.
So growers would write to the experts and say, "Hey, I want to start a vineyard," and they would
Okay.
get information back.
Yeah.
So yes, they were not experienced, but they had ways to learn, and this was a very
Mm,
connected community. It's one of the arguments that I make, about
yeah,
this
yeah.
professionalization of
Hmm.
agriculture and laying the foundation on which citrus would later blossom.
Yeah.
It's because vineyardists put so much work down
Hmm.
in establishing these networks and advocating for state money to found the University of California College of Agriculture, to found the State Agricultural Society, to
Right.
pay for prizes, and to plant experimental vineyards. All of this was hugely
Yeah.
important in establishing industrialized agriculture in California.
Oh, wow. Yeah. True. True. Yeah, and like I can see like writing to like a person in like France or Italy to kind of get how do you do this with regard to wine. It's a lot easier if you're from the country, that specific
Yeah.
country in that language to kind of approach somebody and kind of solicit information or material.
The
Yeah,
one
or
point of clarification
Mhm.
is most of them are not writing to Europe, they're writing to
Oh,
Americans in
oh,
California.
okay.
We had a few folks who had success in New
Uh-huh.
York and Missouri in the Midwest,
Sure.
um, and they came to California.
Yeah.
But by and large, they're just kind of
Internally.
learning on the ground here,
Oh.
occasionally writing to Midwestern growers. But what's interesting is in the 1850s, especially,
Hmm.
many of these new immigrant growers are simply reproducing the practices that had existed since the 1770s, 1780s in Spanish California. So they're just doing what Spanish Franciscans and Mexican Californios had done,
Yeah.
and just continuing that practice.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing us to that early period now because that's where you start the book, right? It's like wine coming to California with the missionaries, with the Spanish colonizers. And what do I have to imagine there? Like, how large a vineyard? Like, how are they producing the wine? Like, labor involved? Like, who's consuming it? Just sort of like, what's the situation like in Colonia, California?
Yeah. So if we're on the ground in 1769, imagining we're
Hmm.
there, the first envoy that came from Baja California, the first priority for the Franciscans was to establish churches.
Okay.
Number one priority,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
And they are, of course, conscripting native Californians to do this labor, to
Hmm.
plant dormitories, churches, plant grain fields. And these native laborers are doing this under the direction of natives from Baja California who had
Hmm.
already done this work of building missions under the direction of missionaries in the southern part of the region.
Hmm.
So the main priority, building churches and feeding people. You
Hmm.
can't convert, it's hard to convert people if they're hungry and
Right.
they're starving.
Yes.
So wine was very important. It was significant for conversion and colonization. Without
Mm.
wine, the Franciscans could not say the Mass. They could not
Right.
demonstrate transubstantiation during the Eucharist for the natives.
Mm.
Feeding them and making sure they weren't starving was the first priority. So it
Right.
took a bit
Yeah.
to establish vineyards. Um,
Mm.
it took about 10 years
Mm.
for that to happen. Before that, the Franciscans mostly relied on irregular supply ships, that would send up crucifixes,
Right.
barrels of wine, chocolate,
Yeah.
or just farm implements
Right.
from
Right. You need
um,
everything, right?
you
Like,
need everything, everything, baptismal ledgers, record books, everything.
yeah.
So you can see why, wine is important, but it takes a
Hmm.
bit at that point.
Well, and it's a
Uh,
bit bulky too when you think of like the barrels, right? It's not like
Very
you
bulky,
a
very
little book, sure, but barrel of wine.
right. And that supply needed to be replenished regularly because,
Yeah.
yes, they used it in the mass. That was the most important use, but they also drank it during meals. This was
Yeah.
very common. But once they were able to, they imported vine cuttings. We think they came from Baja California, And this was the vine that we now know as the mission vine.
Hmm.
And it would, in later generations in the 19th century, be called the native vine, native to California. It
Hmm.
actually wasn't. We believe it was imported um, via Spain to New Spain, to Mexico, and it slowly evolved and made its way through Baja California up to Alta California. So that was the vine they planted. And they did try planting vineyards at most of the missions, but some of them existed in climates that were not suitable to
Hmm.
vine cultivation. I'm thinking of, the areas around San Francisco and Santa Cruz that are colder,
Yeah,
foggy. They just didn't have suitable climates.
yeah.
But they were successful in other areas. Mission San Gabriel became known as La Viña Madre. It had the largest
Wow.
vineyard.
Yeah.
It was the most productive. San
Mm.
Fernando was productive. Santa Barbara,
Mm.
all missions that eventually, San Jose was also
Yeah.
very well known for its wines. The winemaker
Mm.
there was a celebrated winemaker.
Mm.
So the missions that existed in areas with suitable climates planted large vineyards. Sometimes they even planted in the outskirts of the mission on properties that they called estancias. And
Mm.
with that, they were able to supply the mission system as well as soldiers in
Mm.
the presidios, and sometimes even were able to sell to local colonists.
Mm. Wow. Impressive. Now, there's one part that you didn't yet tell us about that I found really fascinating, sort of the evolution of like the wine production in California from like the colonial to like Mexican and then eventually US and the industrialization, if we want to call it that, of winemaking in California. And that is the very process of taking the grapes and getting the juice out of it.
Yeah. Oh gosh, now this was something that was very fraught
Yeah.
for Americans and Euro-American immigrants to California by the 1860s. The old world process of making grapes that had been brought over from Spain was to stomp them out and gather the juices,
Mm-hmm.
and then transport them to a suitable vessel for fermentation. Ideally, this would have been barrels, oak barrels, but in California, that wood was scarce.
Mm-hmm.
So what was not scarce were cattle skins. Many of the missions and also in Mexican California, cattle ranching was common.
Mm-hmm.
So they had ample
Ample
cattle
skin.
skins, and leather
Mm-hmm.
became a vessel for fermenting and storing wine. But other than that, the method that the Franciscans and later the Mexican Californios and later early European immigrants used was for native Californians who were their laborers, sometimes paid, sometimes not,
Uh,
sometimes conscripted or enslaved laborers. But their duty was to harvest the grapes and stomp them, and then the juices would be collected. They'd go through a sieve, and then they'd be fermented. Um, so once we had more scientific, we use scientific in air quotes
yes.
here,
Air quotes.
scientific for the 1860s, based agriculture, these new migrants to California looked at that process with distaste.
Mm.
And that was often rooted in the very real racism against natives at the time in the mid 19th century. And they found it incredibly distasteful, unhygienic that native feet were coming in contact with the product that they were going to drink. So what we see happening in the mid 19th century is this shift from the old time-honored tradition of stomping out the grapes to using mechanized methods. So there were
Mm.
grape presses that would, supposedly separate impurities, rocks, leaves, stems from the grapes, and someone, often a California native, would operate the press and the
Right.
juice would be, extracted and it would go on through the fermentation process. So I do see this this emphasis on race, on purity,
Mm,
on producing wine that was, thought to be clean. And all of this, I argue, is related to the American process of colonization
mhm,
and the American process of moving away from California's Spanish and Mexican past
mhm.
and embracing and creating a new California that was racially white.
Yeah. Even though the labor still was native or Mexican, right? It's
Absolutely.
like,
And that's a great irony is that these
yeah.
vineyards in the 1860s onward, many of them were still relying on, native laborers
Hmm.
as they were available until many of them died off due to disease epidemics. And
Right.
then they transitioned to Chinese workers coming off of the Transcontinental
Mm. Yeah.
Railroad and Mexican laborers.
Mm.
And at the same time, they're saying we're not like those Mexican and Spanish wine growers in the past. They are literally planting mission vines. So their
Yeah.
wines are rooted in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy to think about that kind of like how do you the disconnect, I guess, is the best word of it, right? Of like, no, I'm different from what the colonial periods winemakers were doing, but I'm doing the same thing, just that I don't have a native stump the wine. I'm just using a native to use a press to do the same thing. And it's yeah, it's always fascinating how people can just not connect the dots, I guess, in this case.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, Now that said, let's talk like because I do not drink wine. I have no clue about wine. So you obviously have drank more wine than I have ever in my life. Is there is there a difference between a wine that kind of ages in a barrel versus one that ages in a like cattle hide?
Absolutely. I mean, the vessel in which the wine ages or ferments gives it a flavor. There's a reason
Right.
that today California oak barrel Chardonnay has such a rich, sort of buttery taste. The barrel
Okay,
infuses, it
yeah.
does give it some flavor.
Mhm.
Um, so there's all kinds of debates today about, fermentation in oak barrels versus steel, these big
Oh yeah,
steel.
those steel
Yes.
barrels
So,
or tanks.
I'm not as knowledgeable about that. I think that the enologists over at UC Davis, they write entire books about this. And they're so knowledgeable and skilled. But certainly there's a difference to it.
Hmm.
And I will mention that, the wines made in early California, many of them were on the sweeter side. They were not necessarily
Mm,
dry wines.
okay.
Many times they were a little bit higher in alcohol volume. Some of these unique characteristics to wine made
Yeah,
out of the mission grapes at that
yeah, yeah.
time.
Yeah. No, and in part I was this sort of like again going to kind of Brian's book with regard to sort of the challenges that the orange growers face was like moving their crops, right? Of like if you like yes, you can move an orange fairly easily, but eventually it will have an impact if you move it over too long a distance for too long a time. You don't have that with wine because it's in a barrel, it's a little bit hardier to a long distance move, let's say.
Mhm, mhm.
What's the market of California wine? Like how is it by the 1850s, 1880s still relatively like the West Coast, or have they kind of moved and be like engage in competition on the East Coast against sort of French or like Italian wines by then?
By the later 19th century, many wine growers were expanding their markets.
Mm,
Absolutely, in the early American period and the Mexican period, winemakers in California had local markets.
Okay.
But as the Transcontinental Railroad is complete,
Hmm.
what Euro-American and American wine growers do is they begin to establish trading houses in the major cities of the Eastern and Midwestern United States,
Okay.
Chicago, New York, New Orleans, Boston. And they are there, some of them even hire agents to market their wines in Eastern cities. And the attitude at the time was that California wine was this sort of spurious, sketchy drink, that it was full of additives and it wasn't
Yeah.
pure, um, and it wasn't good
Hmm.
relative to French and Italian wines. So I don't know that they were wrong about that, but about the quality of California wine. But this was their attempt to combat that. And one of the ways
Yeah.
that California wine growers did this is by establishing the organizations like the California Wine Association at the turn of the 20th century, which was an organization that part of its work was marketing,
Yeah.
really convincing Americans that, hey, California wine is pure. We're using pure grapes. We're not
Hmm.
adding to it. California wine is healthful. It's good for your health. It will prevent drunkenness. So there was a lot of consumer education that came out of the CWA, or the California Wine Association.
Yeah, it was just like when you mentioned organization and sort of promotion, I was exactly going to ask next about like the California Wine Growers Association, sort of like the kind of association in general. But I kind of was also um kind of look which when it was, but you have this one episode where you talk in the I think it's in the mid to late 19th century where Californian, oh yeah, here in 1867, where California tries to go to that international exposition in Paris and promote its wines. And
Yes.
it's this utter disaster, right? Like they're not even taken serious here. Now, is that just old world snobbery because it's sort of like, ah, these new world people, they don't know how to do wine? Or is it real that 1860s California wine just wasn't as good as European wines would have been?
I think it's a little bit of both.
That's
I think certainly there was, I mean, even 100 years ago with the Judgment of Paris, when in the
yeah.
1970s, a little more than 100 years ago, there was still snobbery about American wines and California wines. So absolutely, that's part of it. But I do think that there were issues with California wine at the time, and I've not had the privilege of discovering, a dusty bottle of wine from 1867 or 1865 and sampling it. But we do have evidence that perhaps it was not on par with wines being produced in other areas. And again, Mission wines were often very, very sweet, very high in their alcohol content, a little headier. So this is just a little different
Oh,
than the wines they were being compared to in France at
that
that
would be
time.
a great project. It's like a local school here in town where I live. They have like well, local school. It's sort of a college, and they produce beer with modern technology, obviously, like in Roman times, like Roman beer. Yeah, like so I kind of was like, maybe you could get like one of the universities in California to do a science experiment. And like, here's how the missions produced wine, and let's produce wine like the missions did, and let's see what the result is.
I think that would be fascinating. I know that there are local wine growers here in California, especially within the community of vintners and wine growers who are interested in biodynamic wines. There are
Oh,
people who are growing
they're
mission
trying.
wines
Oh,
and experimenting with that. I had the privilege of trying a mission wine. Oh gosh, it's been probably 20 years. And it wasn't a California mission wine. It was grown in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert.
ooh,
And at the time, I did not think it was very good.
ooh.
But I'm told now that these wine growers are really, trying to plant things that are more native, accustomed to
Right.
their climate, and they're doing amazing things with this. So I've been
Yeah.
meaning to track down a bottle and sample it, for research purposes.
Yeah, of
I've
course,
not had
totally.
that opportunity because I think it would be really curious and interesting to
Yeah,
try a varietal of grape that I'm not, you
yeah,
know, had in a long time, yet is so fundamental to understanding the history of where I live.
yeah. Well, there's a research trip, I guess.
Mhm.
It's fascinating when you think of it, right? Like my wife, she's been buying some wine at Lidl in Austria, and every
Mhm.
bottle she buys is California wine, right?
Really?
Yeah,
Oh,
they have
interesting.
California wine in Lidl in Austria. It's like you have Aussie Italian and French and German wines, but there's also California wine.
Oh,
I hardly ever walk by that section of the store, so I didn't get kind of look of like how easily you spot that one, but like I guess it's pretty easy to see like, oh, there's a California wine.
yeah. Mhm.
Global brand today. Crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It's amazing that, I mean, California produces over 90% of American wine, including the export. So it doesn't surprise me,
yeah.
but I'd be curious to compare the prices, because I
Mm.
know, does the import taxes raise prices? Because wine is so affordable in Europe relative to the United States. So
Yes.
yeah, we
Like
don't have all the,
buying a beer in Europe is cheaper than buying a soda.
right, or water.
Yeah.
Um, so that's an interesting question.
Let me see. I might actually be able to tell. I let me do two samples. About under €2 for the bottle of wine.
Under €2 for a bottle of wine. And then
Yep.
is that a European wine or an American wine?
No, I think this is a European wine.
Okay, so that would make sense to me.
No,
Maybe
I
the
think
American
American
one.
wine. I think it's
Oh, wow.
American. Yeah, I think it's
Wow.
American. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Want me to ship some back? That's probably the
Oh,
worst. See,
hmm,
shipping costs are too expensive for individuals like us.
right, right.
Um, so keeping an eye on the time here for us. Ooh, so one of the themes of your book is settler colonialism, which is like a major topic in a lot of Western history today, like whether it's dealing with Native Americans, Western lands, growing of crops. And obviously with California, we're also dealing, and especially Southern California, with a lot of water issues, right? Let's call it that, because Southern California is a very dry climate. So how do you see the problems of irrigation, planting wine kind of intersect and engage sort of that larger theme you have in the book with regard to settler colonialism?
Hmm, hmm. Oh,
That's
I
a big
love that
question.
question. Yeah, I love that question. Well, I will say, first off, that California natives had their own system of resource management and land management.
Mhm.
And that knowledge, many times the Franciscans just ignored it, right? And said, no, we have our own agricultural experts that we've brought from Baja California, and that knowledge was often lost. They also relied on an agricultural manual that they brought with them from Spain. Luckily, the climate in California is very Mediterranean, like that of Spain. So they lucked
Yeah,
out
yeah.
in that they had success simply because of that accident,
Accident.
that their place of origin had a climate that was very similar to
Yeah.
where they landed here in Alta California. So in Spanish California, We'll say that the Spanish missionaries, the pobladores, the Mexican colonists,
Hmm.
and then later in Mexican California, the Californios did build irrigation systems. Sometimes they reflected systems of water use that California natives had used. They just kind of built over
Hmm.
those. Um, Other times they were newer in accessing water from different rivers that, California natives hadn't been using for their own resource use. So these sanjas were in existence when Americans came. I
Okay.
will also say that some vineyardists, again, stretching across the three political periods I discussed, Spanish, Mexican, and American, simply did not irrigate their grapes heavily. The
Mm.
thinking being that you didn't need to water grapes that much because the roots would dig down deep to access um, groundwater, and also that a little bit of struggle for the grapes was good. You might not have as large a crop, but the flavor of the grapes was thought to be more concentrated and a little bit
Mhm.
better. So, grapes are a little bit of they're a fussy crop. Too much water is
Yeah.
not good for them. Um, Too little, though, is not good for them. So they weren't,
Yeah.
100% wrong about the concentrated flavor of the grapes,
Mhm.
which is interesting. But I think that your broader point, though, is that part of this history looks at the process of conquest of the landscape and the environment, right?
Mhm.
How
Yeah.
how are these settler colonialists coming in and superseding, erasing,
Mhm.
overriding native land use? What are the consequences of the
Yeah.
water they use? What are the consequences of the foreign plants and animals they
Mhm.
introduce to the region? I mean, just with that last point, we know that the consequences were really significant for California natives in disrupting
Mhm.
their own food supplies.
Yeah.
So you can go at that question from so many angles,
Mhm.
and environmental history isn't a huge focus of my book, but I hope someone writes that environmental
Mhm.
history of California wine because it's missing and it's just so important to
Right.
understanding the transformation of California across the long
Mhm.
19th century.
Well, yeah, and it goes back to the same point of like the natives are the ones that, yeah, they're the ones dying out and dying off, and
Mhm, mhm,
it was their land at the start of all of it, and they're the
mhm,
ones suffering at the end, which is the kind of
mhm.
sad reality of it. On the other hand, so it's like with any food crop, you're always dependent on the environment, right? Like I just saw a picture in the news because the mountains got some snow over the weekend, and you have pictures of like these, like not large, but these wine fields, and there's snow on it, and all these vineyards are kind of like, oh God, this is going to be terrible.
Mhm.
So you're always dependent on sort of the environment as a farmer, as anyone engaged in agriculture. How about like you already mentioned Pierce disease, if I remember correctly. And then we also have like in Europe, I remember they had a big disease too that almost decimates the French wine industry. How much is disease a problem for vineyards?
It's a huge problem. Again, grapevines are delicate. And I mentioned Pierce's disease earlier and how it hasn't gone away. Even
Mhm.
today, if you mention the glassy winged
Wow.
sharpshooter, which is the vector of that disease, if you mention it, it's going to be in the news, and growers are going to be taking that very seriously and will be
Wow.
incredibly vigilant and monitoring their vineyards for any sign. I mean, this is the reason why, if you've ever driven into California, you will be stopped and asked to, at
Yeah.
the Arizona-California border, you're stopped and asked to hey, you got any fruit? Yep, I have a banana and an orange. Sorry, it's got to stay here. There's a reason we monitor that so
Mm.
closely. But if we go back to the 19th century, your mention of phylloxera, that also made an appearance in California, specifically Northern California,
Yeah.
Napa and Sonoma. on Vitis vinifera vines. These were European grape varietals, and
Okay.
they were very, very susceptible to the phylloxera louse. It's a louse that attaches itself to the rootstock and slowly
Mhm.
kills the vine. And it's a complicated process, but I'm giving you the
Yeah.
Cliff's Note version there. Um, but what ends up happening with that episode is American and French wine growers had to collaborate essentially to
Mm,
um, basically they used American grape stock, which was disease resistant. It was resistant to phylloxera. It had evolved and developed that resistance. So they grafted
yeah.
American disease resistant grapevines to the Vitis vinifera vines, the French vines,
Mm,
and that is how they were able to save the wine industry in France and in the United States. And this is a
mm,
fascinating area of study that many people have written books on.
yeah. Kind of irony, right? So the Americans have to rescue the French wine industry, and even though the French
Yeah,
don't like American wine. Um, so speaking of, there's like two more topics that I definitely want to talk about, and one of them is like the racism. And when I've been with the Orange Empire, or oranges, citrus, lemon empire, he had these incredible images in his book of like racism, of like these orange growers putting like this whitewash past on the boxes, on like the wrappings of the oranges, or like Native Americans and sort of war bonnets and like utter racism. Do we have something similar with the wine industry, that kind of like racism with regard to like Native Americans or Hispanics, to kind of give a whitewashed past of the vineyards?
absolutely. Absolutely. Part of that has to do with the concerns about cleanliness and, Indian
Hmm.
feet versus the machines that I've already discussed. But one of the areas I explore in terms of this race making and citizenship, access to citizenship, involves access to wine, right? Who had
Hmm.
legal access to enjoy wine? Not California natives. And that is something
Yeah.
that was true across Spanish, Mexican, and American California, where it was strictly prohibited to give them wine. Now, did growers give it to them as a form of payment? Absolutely, they did. And these California natives would drink it over the
Hmm.
weekend, on Saturday night after payday, if they were
Yeah.
being paid. Sometimes they were paid in lieu of cash wages, they were given wine against the law. They would drink it in downtown Los Angeles. It would be a great raucous party, a violent party in downtown
Hmm.
Los Angeles. And then on Sunday night or Monday morning, they would be rounded up, arrested, and then essentially sold out as convict laborers to the very vineyardists who paid them in wine. Another area we see is in wages. I found instances in the archives where growers would describe the process of paying their workers, their vineyard workers. The example I used was Leonard J. Rose, who was a German wine grower with a vineyard in what is now like San Marino, Pasadena. And per his son and those memories, his father on Saturday nights, payday, would stand on the porch and pay some of his employees. And the way it worked was white men who worked at his vineyard, Sunny Slope, would get paid whenever they felt like it. So if they wanted to draw wages on a Wednesday, they could. They could be paid for, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Um, Mexican workers were paid on Saturday night, and each one would go and interact with El Patron, the boss. He would pay them their
Hmm.
cash wages and also give them some wine as part of their wages. And that was true for white men as well. Interestingly, Chinese men never interacted with Leonard J. Rose themselves. They had one appointed person who would meet with Leonard J. Rose once a month, and that person would collect wages for the entire work crew. and no wine was included. And their wages were, of course, less. So these were prorated by race.
Good God. That's
Yeah,
just terrible.
yeah.
Yeah, but that's
This
those stories, right? You know?
Right. And this is the process by which race and citizenship and hierarchies were
Yeah,
made. We know from the work of Natalia Molina, race isn't made in a vacuum, right? It's
yeah,
relational.
yeah.
So this is part of the process by which race was made
In the
in
West.
California.
Yeah, yeah. And that sort of exactly leads to where I kind of wanted to go with the final question for us tonight. That when I read your book, I kind of was seeing like like two big intersections, right? On in part, it seemed like your book exactly speaks to like what we have with the Gilded Age. Like there's a crop, there's an industry, it modernizes, it industrializes, it embraces all kinds of new technology, and then these monopolies start to develop. Like it's
Hmm.
the sort of the stereotypical Gilded Age story. But then with the reimagining of race, it also felt like we have that what Elliot West has described that greater reconstruction of in the Americas, sort of that rethinking of how this race question in the United States plays out. And it's not just black and white in the South after slavery, but it's black, it's white, it's Hispanic, it's Native American, it's Chinese, it's so many of them in the West. So I felt like you had sort of these two big themes that just kind of started to work together there as the book got into the mid to late 19th century.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight. This is it's a California story, but it's not an American story. It is,
Right.
of course, an American story
Yeah.
and reflective of what is happening in the rest of the country at that time. So absolutely. I think what is unique to California is although there is this nostalgic memory of
Mm-hmm.
yeoman Jeffersonian farmers, I would argue, and I think this is true in the historiography on California, that really never existed here. We
Yeah.
had very early on large scale farms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Large landowners who could not possibly
Yeah.
farm or cultivate their property alone. They
Mm-hmm.
needed workers, whether they were conscripted or enslaved natives, later on Mexican or Chinese wage workers, or white men who were wage workers. So that's absolutely part of the story. And then managing those large swaths of property relied on,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they needed
Right.
mechanization, fertilizer, modern science to be able to use that land productively. So it's absolutely part of the latter half of the 19th century and the modernization and
Mm-hmm.
mechanization of agriculture. The other part about what you said about Americans moving past that black-white binary is so important. And I think it's interesting in California, what the literature tells us and what I found in my own research was the fact that there were so many different groups here, California natives, Spanish Californios, Mexicans,
Mm-hmm.
Irish, Italians, Germans, Chinese. It complicated the understanding of race that migrants from the eastern states brought with them. They looked around and they said, hey, it's not just us and Black Americans here, there are other people.
Mm-hmm.
And what is interesting in terms of the wine industry and the groups involved there is that European immigrants, I would argue, and others have argued as well, use that to assert their
Mm-hmm.
own whiteness and claim American citizenship far earlier than they were able to do in other parts of the country. In my book, it's a lot of Germans who,
Mm-hmm.
even though they still speak German and retain German culture, are celebrated for bringing modernity and American industriousness to the Los Angeles area. And
Right.
what read
Yeah.
between the lines, what people meant was whiteness. They're bringing
Yeah.
whiteness.
Yeah.
In the Midwest, Germans were not celebrated for that. They were seen as
Right.
foreign.
Yeah.
And certainly the Irish, even worse in
Yeah.
the eastern states, where they were absolutely prohibited from claiming the rights of American citizenship in the 19th century. That just wasn't available to them, but in California it was. And
Yeah.
one of the big points I make, if we move broader, is that California's 19th century wine industry was really multiracial, it was
Mhm.
multi-ethnic. And I think it challenges the perception that California wine was the sole endeavor of Italian American immigrants.
Oh
Were
yeah.
they were they important to the California wine industry? Absolutely they were, especially in the 20th century. But to say that I think one of the words that I often see associated with California's Italian American winemakers is that they were pioneers. And I
Mm,
would argue that word is a fallacy because
yeah.
they came in at the turn of the 20th century and again after World War II and built up an industry that already
Mm,
existed.
yeah.
They didn't build it from scratch. And I think it's important to look at that and sort of claim a space and say, hey, the California wine industry was born from the labor of native peoples, of Chinese immigrants, Mexicans, Californios, Germans, Chinese, I mentioned the Chinese already, Irish immigrants. It is really an amazing story that is not just about one group.
That is a perfect end. No, and exactly right. That's like there's so much to untangle in that of all the different peoples that are involved, and like it's just the thing a lot of people enjoy has such a complicated racial history in California. It's incredible.
Mhm, mhm.
So with that, um, you have your meeting coming up here in a few minutes. Thank you so much, Julia, for joining us today for this really enlightening conversation about California wine. Her book, just as a reminder for everyone, The Grapes of Conquest, Race, Labor, and the Industrialization of California Wine, is available with the University of Nebraska Press. Very interesting book to read if you want to know more about wine in California and its long history. Again,
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Thanks for having me.